Good morning, all. Welcome to this latest Fairness, Inclusion and Respect Brunch and Learn. This one is going to be on how to retain disabled talent. Hi, I'm Jez Cutler. I'm a fur trainer, been a fur trainer for 1 or 2 years now, and have done a few sort of face-to-face courses, not too many of these webinars in the new world that we live in. But looking forward to doing this. Also, we've got Sarah on the line as well, who's going to help present. So what I want to do today is 4 things. Thinking about retaining disabled colleagues, disabled staff, disabled people. I think it's important that we start to think about the variety of disabilities that exist, how actually quite common many of them are. And then through that, we can start to understand what kind of adjustments might be necessary. It's also really important that we look at the medical and social model perspective, the different lenses with which you can actually look at disability. We can also then, once we've got a bit of an appreciation of that, start to think about some of the practical tips and examples of the types of reasonable adjustments. We'll hear that word a lot that can be made. And then last and not least, just a signpost to 1 or 2 excellent resources which you may or may not be aware of that really are worth looking at. Before we really get going, I just want to think about the number 19. I was going to talk about 19, the song by Paul Hardcastle, but then I realised that most of you won't know what I'm talking about because that was from the 1980s and it's rather betraying my age. But 19 actually is right more present, isn't it? Because it's COVID-19 that we're all stuck inside for right now. 19 is a really important number when we're thinking about disabilities as well, not least because 19% of the working population is living with some kind of impairment. And there are at least, or more or less, 19 different types of groups of impairments that you can think of. So remember the number 19. It's an important number in this context. Okay, so let's think about what disability is and what being disabled is. So you're disabled if you've got a physical or mental impairment. It has to be substantial and it has to lead to a long-term adverse effect on your ability to carry out a normal day-to-day activity. I've already said there's 19 different types of impairment. And I will share a reasonably long list with you now because I think it's important just to really get that disability into the context that it is very broad. It affects lots of different people in different ways to different degrees. But when you're thinking about making adjustments in order to retain the talent that goes along with that disability, it's important to be thinking broadly across a huge range. So we think about all these different impairments. So you've got sensory impairments, which are obviously sight and hearing, fluctuating and recurring effects and impairments could be things like fibromyalgia, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis, epilepsy, things like that. Progressive impairments could be muscular dystrophy, some forms of dementia, motor neuron disease. Developmental impairments would be sort of dyspraxia, dyslexia, things like that. Learning disabilities would be Down syndrome. You've also got organ-specific failures like strokes, heart attacks, asthma, cardiovascular diseases, mental health conditions and mental illness. So eating disorders, bipolar effects, panic attacks, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and depression. And you've also got injuries to the brain and to the body, which are multiple and never ending, so I'm not going to give you a list of those. Equalities Act 2010 talks about your substantial being anything outside of the normal, in essence, and long-term being over 12 months. So if you think of any of those impairments, if you're suffering from those for more than 12 months, then under the Equalities Act, you can be considered, or you are considered, to be a disabled person, and the Equalities Act comes into play. Okay, so that's what a disability is, and that's what being disabled is. Now let's think about that through a different lens. Let's think about that through a medical and social model. The medical model is the model that we're all familiar with, which is disability is an abnormality and a deficit of the body. Disabled people are broken, damaged versions of normal, and their impairments prevent them from functioning normally, so they need help and they need support. That's kind of the traditional model of disability. The social model of disability has been around for 7 or 8 years. The Equalities Act enshrines it. It's a different way of thinking about disability, and it's a model that when you're thinking about reasonable adjustments, you should try and see those reasonable adjustments through this model. It's where the person is disabled by the environment, our attitudes and communication barriers, and disabled people are normal, valid varieties of human beings. And since that person is therefore inherently equal, they have freedom and choice and free to informed consent in their own lives. I'm going to show you a video now on the medical and social model.
According to the medical model of disability, the word disabled means less able. Less able to achieve your potential, less able to have meaningful relationships, less able to play an active part in the world around you, and that this is just your bad luck. This outdated view of the world puts the responsibility of overcoming disabling barriers on the person with an impairment. But this idea is changing. The more modern social model of disability says that a person doesn't have a disability, but that they are disabled. They are disabled by society. It is the attitudes and physical barriers imposed on them by society that prevents them from achieving their potential. The social model was developed by disabled people and their allies to help them take action against discrimination and to empower people to find solutions, remove barriers, and campaign together for equality and human rights. They showed how people with lots of different impairments face many of the same problems. These disabling barriers include prejudiced opinions and attitudes, restricted access, and people being systematically excluded. The social model looks for the ways that society can be planned and organised in order to provide accessibility, independence, and opportunity in a way that enables people rather than disables them. What we learn from the social model of disability is that disability is a social construct created by social barriers, barriers which can be eliminated. We learn that it is the responsibility of government, public spaces, businesses, and individual people to make the changes, to increase the access, and build a more equal society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
I think that's just a really useful reinforcement of what the social model of disability looks like. So I mentioned 19 before, right at the beginning. Going to come back to that number. 19% of the working age population has an impairment. So what does that look like if you put that into the context of the construction workforce? There's 1.36 million construction workers. according to the ONS stats for the last reporting period. So if the construction workforce was representative of working age, that would mean there'd be 258,400 construction employees with a disability or an impairment, which is quite a few. Their actual rates, about 0.1% of people in the construction sector would consider themselves disabled, which is far, far, far fewer than 258,000. But this isn't about the difference between a representative workforce and the actual rates. This is really just showing the numbers could be like, and probably showing how underreported those numbers are. Let's have a look at some of these other stats. So 25% of disabled people only would consider themselves disabled. That's an important factor, that disability can be quite difficult for people to talk about, even if they're disabled themselves, for lots of reasons, because they fear the consequence of telling you that they're disabled, potentially. In the workplace, I think that's often the case. In the context of retaining workers, only 17% of disabled people were born with that disability. So in construction, there could be a couple 100,000 construction workers, many of which could become disabled while they're employed with yourselves. So retention becomes an even greater imperative, if you like, because they're already with us. Some of the common disabilities around dyslexia, we mentioned it before, very, very common. Up to 10% of the UK could have dyslexia. 53% of disabled people say they have 3 or more impairments. So that's quite important. This concept of the comorbidities, if you like, the fact that disabled people tend to have more than one impairment, obviously has a bearing on how you retain that person, how you make the adjustments that are needed. 52% of disabled people have mobility issues. 6% have audiovisual issues. 10% of disabled people say they suffer from a mental health condition. So I think that starts to show breadth and scale of disability within the workforce, and disabled people potentially within the construction sector workforce. So I've mentioned reasonable adjustments a few times already. Why am I talking about reasonable adjustments? Because that's what the law says you have to do. The Equalities Act 2010 talks about reasonable adjustments as being changes which are designed to prevent people with disabilities or medical conditions from being substantially disadvantaged. It is the employer's duty to make those reasonable adjustments under the 2010 Act. So why do they talk about substantial disadvantage? Well, because then there is a way of testing whether the person affected has been disadvantaged or not. So you can be significantly or substantially disadvantaged, or it could be a minor disadvantage. So in practice, the reasonable adjustments that you make should mitigate for the substantial disadvantage, but they don't have to remove the disadvantage completely. That's a lawyer's golden field, if you like, but it's important that when you're thinking about from a practical point of view, that you're not looking to necessarily eliminate, but you're looking to remove the substantial part of it. But the substantial disadvantage is quite an interesting area to look at. Now, I did a little bit of looking at case law in preparation for this, and you're probably thinking, well, what's substantial and what's not substantial? And I wouldn't get too hung up on that. If you're thinking about making reasonable adjustments for disabilities, then you'll make the adjustments in combination with the person that's disabled anyway, and you'll try and get the best advantage for them that you can, or remove the most disadvantage, I should say. But if you think about Marks and Spencer's had an issue where they were found by the employment tribunal to have discriminated against a disabled person because they didn't provide them with a toilet key after they had a bladder infection. and that was found to be a substantial disadvantage. So what you're thinking is as substantial may not be as big as you think it is. That's what I'm trying to say. Key thing, it's the employer's responsibility to identify the adjustment and to make it, not the employee's responsibility to tell you as the employer what needs to be done. And I think that's really, really key. And it's not something which perhaps is widely appreciated, that you are, as the employer, expected to identify and to know and to make those reasonable adjustments. Now, in practice, you'll probably ask the disabled person what reasonable adjustments they need, and that person can probably tell you. But in law, it's your responsibility to identify and to do it, not the employee's responsibility to ask you or even to tell you what it is that they need. And there is likely to be more than one set of adjustments required. It's not a case of fix it once and forget about it. Fix it and you have to keep going back to it time and time again because needs clearly do change. Consequence of inaction, I think you'll all be probably aware of, is that there is discrimination. It can go to employment tribunal. Employment tribunal awards can be unlimited, and employment tribunal outcomes are also public. So there's a reputational issue at stake. Okay, this triangle I want to invert. So when you're thinking about reasonable adjustments, start at 5 and go to 1. Policies should always be first, because HR policies can unintentionally be discriminatory against disabled people, particularly policies around sickness absence, where you work hours, and how, if you have them, how you advance in seniority through the company. There can be conditions put around all of those which are discriminatory towards disabled people. Not going to touch on that anymore in this section, because this section is more about making reasonable adjustments in the other areas around the behaviours that we have and hold as managers and as colleagues, about some of the physical aids that can be provided, physical and non-physical, I should say, aids that can be provided to help disabled people so that that substantial disadvantage is removed. Some of the changes to work flows and work processes that can be made so that those substantial disadvantages are removed. And some of those physical changes to the workplace, either physical to the structures and the buildings where the disabled person works, or physical by changing the location of that disabled person to make their work life easier and to remove that substantial disadvantage. So I'm just going to look at 4 relatively common, or 4 very common impairments, and we're going to, just through that, just think about some of the common reasonable adjustments that can be made. So we're thinking about hearing impairment, and what I've done is I've split them up. For each of the 4 impairments, I've split them into physical changes that you might make or consider making, process changes that you can consider making, aids that you can consider providing, and behaviours that you certainly should look to review and to change. So let's read the screen from left to right and think about behaviours. So company handbooks are often written. Not all deaf people or people with hearing impairments can read. In fact, literacy around people with hearing impairments is quite low. So you probably need to think about whether there's a different way of providing policies and rules and all of the things like that that you would usually just give somebody to read. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can look at them. This material is available as well, or will be available to you offline, and we'll send you copies of these slide decks. Hearing impairment around safety is obviously very, very important. Safety critical warnings, the classic truck reversing beepers, are great as long as you can hear. If you can't hear, do you need to think about warnings being visual and audible, perhaps? Do you need to think about installing a hearing loop? Probably not on a construction site, but possibly in a construction office if you've got people or a person there with a hearing impairment. Depression. 1 in 5 of us is suffering from depression at some point in their lives. It's an area that many of us live with, but we can be highly practical and creative despite that. But there are some considerations that you might want to give in the workplace to somebody that's suffering from depression. The main 2 areas that I would pull out of this list, I think, are around behaviours, where if somebody is willing, then you may want to share the fact that somebody has depression with their work, with their colleagues, so that their colleagues can start an open and supportive discussion around depression, and to bring that out into the open and to talk about how the work life affects that depression and how supportive equally it can be. The other area I think that is particularly useful around depression, particularly when people are feeling overwhelmed, and we all have it, I'm sure, we all have periods where we feel overwhelmed. And when we feel overwhelmed, or when I feel overwhelmed, what I do is I try and set clear and achievable goals. And I think that's really useful. So in the process area, if you think about, is it possible to provide focus to that work, probably shorter term, but really clear short-term achievable goals, so that you can sort of really tick them off and feel like process is happening, and as a worker you are achieving something. So physical impairments, it's defined as someone not being able to perform without assistance 2 or 3 of the 6 basic activities of daily life, daily living. That's washing, eating, transferring, dressing, those kind of activities, which so if you can't do more than 2, if you can't do more than 2 of those, then you've probably got a physical impairment. And it's the physical impairments where you tend to, not surprisingly perhaps, tend to need more of the physical reasonable adjustments for. So it might be that the workplace isn't accessible if you have a physical environment. So you need to think about, can you provide an accessible room? No lift, no stairs. Are suitable toilet facilities available nearby? If not, can that person work somewhere else? Can you change the working routine so that accessible environments can be provided elsewhere? That could mean that the activities of the role potentially need to be changed. Can they be changed? Can you think about that? So concept of work carving, work sharing, if you like. Are there some activities that person can no longer do because they're physically impaired? That could be given to someone else. And can, in exchange, that person who is disabled pick up some new activities that they can do? Those kind of activity swapping, activity carving solutions are within scope in this sense. All of these things I would add, particularly when you're thinking about those kind of changes, well, all these changes, but particularly with these changes, do need to be consensual. Obviously, you've got to have these conversations with the disabled person and to bring them along and get their thinking and get their involvement in what is a reasonable adjustment and what isn't. But remember, it is your responsibility as the employer. So dyslexia, very common condition. Many people live with it undiagnosed. It is something that people can largely overcome with skilled teaching and compensatory strategies, many of which people will be very adept at deploying. But there are some reasonable adjustments that can be made to people that are struggling. And dyslexia is a an impairment, which means that if people have it, can be considered disabled, and reasonable adjustments, therefore, may be required by law. So in the behaviours, this is what I've, again, just reinforcing the point, talk to the disabled person about what strategies that individual uses and may find useful. With all of these reasonable adjustments, always talk to the person affected. They are the subject matter expert. They are the person that's going to have the best view on what reasonable adjustments are required, and they are most likely to be able to tell you what works and what doesn't. But dyslexic people may find that memory aids are useful. Voice recorders, for example, or screen reader software, voice-activated software could equally be useful. In the process column, what I would say is that providing paper or notes in advance of meetings is quite an interesting adaptation or reasonable adjustment. And you might say that's easy to do, and it might be for most meetings, but it could involve back to process or back to policy even. It could involve quite a major change to policy if you've got to provide paper or notes in advance to all meetings. If you think about some disciplinary meetings, you probably would. Some HR meetings, all of these things you'd have to think through and make sure that all meetings paper can be provided in advance if that's the reasonable adjustment that you're looking to make for dyslexic people. Okay, so that been through the just four of 19, remember, and you see that each one has a different set of reasonable adjustments, and all 19 have all got different reasonable adjustments. There's some common ones and there's some specific ones. The set of reasonable adjustments that you need to make are almost as unique as the disabled person that you're looking to make that reasonable adjustment for. The key is to talk to that person there, the subject matter expert. The key is to review that often and to review that frequently, and to remember that that reasonable adjustment is probably not going to need to only happen once, but may need to happen again and again and potentially again. There are one or two aspects or one or two resources that can help, and one of them is access to work. And if you haven't heard of access to work and you are in a situation where you have a disabled people that you're looking to retain, then it's a very, very useful resource. Not least because it's money, it's real money. It's a government fund which is not very well advertised, and it will do lots and lots of things. That's not an exhaustive list that you're looking at there. The disabled person is the person that needs to apply rather than the employer, but it is capped these days, the amount that you can get, but it will cover support workers, it will cover expensive wheelchairs, it will cover adaptations to cars, it will cover job counselling, sign language, it will cover lots and lots of different areas where the adjustment is beyond what you might otherwise be able to afford, I think is probably the best way of putting it. If you can, as a business, afford to make that adjustment yourself, then it's likely that you'll be expected to make that adjustment. If the adjustment is bigger than what is reasonable to you as a business, and that does depend on size, cost of the adjustment and complexity, then access to work is more likely to step in and to support that disabled person. So most of what I've shared with you just in the last half hour or so has been from the Remploy's Disability Guide. It will be available through this exercise, through this webinar, but it is also available in print in the Disability Guide. And that's got all 19 disabilities in there. It's not laid out in quite the same way that I've laid it out for you here, but it is very, very worth looking at if you want to know more. And I've also given you the Access to Work website address there as well. Just a quick reminder about how first it's in the supply chain school and where you can go for more general information. Hopefully you'll use the school on a regular basis and you've seen this and you know how valuable it is. And if you haven't looked at it for a while, go back because it keeps getting updated and there's lots of new material there. Not least, we just put the Remploy guide up there only yesterday. So the FUR toolkit, which is on the supply chain school site, has got the resources, it's got case studies, you've got training lessons in there, and you've obviously got social media feeds to look at as well. Thank you for your time. Hope that was interesting.